Let's look at Reagan foreign policy. Under Jimmy Carter, U.S. prestige and our world standing had dropped to a new low. During his time in office, Reagan's going to regain that high position. He's going to regain it through defense and defense spending, really retake world supremacy from the USSR. And he does it really by challenging the USSR. He has a lucky break, a good start in that the Iran hostage crisis ends on his first day in office. Now, Carter had asked Congress for a 5% increase in defense spending. Reagan doubles that, asks for a 10% increase. And by 1985, he's gotten most of it, including new technological innovations like the B-1 bomber seen there on the bottom half of the screen, the MX missile, and more Navy ships. In 1982, President Reagan goes before the United Nations and challenges the USSR, denounces the USSR, accuses them, the Soviet Union, of supporting rebels and terrorists all over the world. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan is the biggest example that he references. So it's clear Reagan is done with détente. He's not going to be doing any easing of tensions like Nixon with the Soviet Union. In 1983, he puts missiles in Europe, in our allied NATO powers in Europe. These are missiles that could easily hit Moscow and other Russian cities. This goes directly against, it's a violation of that nuclear freeze movement that had started in the 1970s. So, not surprisingly, the Soviet Union ends disarmament talks. Under Reagan, tensions with the Soviet Union are rising. And they continue to rise with the announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the media nicknames Star Wars. It was this elaborate system of satellites that could be used to shoot down missiles fired from the Soviet Union. In all likelihood, most historians agree now that it never really would have worked, but the talk of this and the development of this and the work on this causes the Soviet Union to buy even more missiles. So really, under Reagan, he's flexing the United States military and economic might to get back on top. Let's shift to another part of the world, Central America. In Central America, specifically in Nicaragua, a group known as the Sandinistas had taken power. And Jimmy Carter had provided economic aid to this newly empowered group so that they didn't turn to Cuba to get it, so that they didn't turn to the Soviet Union to get it. When Reagan comes into office, he cuts off that aid. He says that they are already cooperating with Cuba and the Soviet Union. And whether or not they were, this leads to them directly doing just that. After Reagan cuts off aid, they are definitely on the side of the Soviet Union and especially Cuba. Reagan's administration would like to get rid of the Sandinistas. They see them as communists. They see them as Soviet sympathizers. They see them as a threat in the Western Hemisphere. They would like to get rid of the Sandinistas using these guys, known as Contras. This is a group that opposed the Sandinistas that Reagan and his administration would like to aid and assist. But Congress says no, we're not going into a jungle country to fight communism where it probably doesn't matter. This sounds a little bit too much like Vietnam. Reagan begins to use the CIA to fund the Contras. These are the rebels that are fighting the Sandinistas. And they're using that support, that aid from the Reagan administration to do things like attack villages and blow up oil tanks and put mines in harbors. These are things that we would call terrorist acts today. Congress quickly passes what's known as the Boland Amendment, which prohibits any U.S. government agency, especially the CIA, from spending money in Central America. This means, or at least seems to mean, no more funding for the Contras. Let's put a pin in this, the Contras, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. We'll hear more about this in a minute. Let's jump over to the Middle East quickly, though. Israel gives back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. That's that little chunk of land between Israel and Egypt. This is part of the agreement made in the Camp David Accords under Jimmy Carter. Reagan would like Israel to also give land to Palestinians, Arabs living in Israel, in the West Bank. That's that region right in the middle of the screen, along the West Bank of the Dead Sea. But Israel has not yet done that. And the Palestinian Liberation Organization, known as the PLO, is raiding Israel from their bases in Lebanon, north of Israel. It's that gray country on the map there. In 1982, Israel invades Lebanon to try to destroy the PLO. They consider the PLO a terrorist organization. The PLO has caused a number of Israeli civilian deaths. So Israel invades nearby Lebanon to try to destroy the PLO. The United States intervenes, goes into Lebanon to try to help with the evacuation of Palestinian civilians. But the United States is entering into Lebanon, where they are in the midst of a civil war. For many people in the Middle East, this is perceived as the United States going in to help Christians in Lebanon who are fighting against Muslims. It looks like the United States is going in to help the government of Lebanon, the Christian government, in their civil war struggle against Muslims in Lebanon. And President Reagan, despite these optics, wants to keep American soldiers in Lebanon to guard against any communist influence in the region. For example, the Soviet Union in next-door Syria had a lot of influence. They were strongly supportive of the Syrian government. Unfortunately, a terrorist attack on the U.S. barracks in Lebanon kills 239 U.S. soldiers. That leads to a withdrawal of American forces from Lebanon. And by 1984, the last U.S. soldiers leave Lebanon, and the region is really worse off than before. Jumping back home quickly, in the 1984 election, President Reagan easily wins re-election over Walter Mondale, the Democrat from Minnesota. As a side note, Geraldine Ferraro, Mondale's running partner, was the first woman on a major party ticket. So let's go back to the Middle East. Let's explain the most confusing aspect of Reagan's foreign policy, the Iran-Contra affair. Here's what happened. After the time the United States spent in Lebanon, there were some U.S. hostages in Lebanon. Those U.S. hostages in Lebanon are being held by people that are loyal to the Ayatollah Khomeini, the religious leader in Iran. So here's the plan the U.S. government under Ronald Reagan comes up with, the executive branch, the CIA, comes up with to try to get those hostages released. The United States will sell weapons to Iran because they're in a war with Iraq. In exchange, the Ayatollah and the Iranian government will try to get those, and they did get those hostages released. This is conducted by Oliver North and CIA Director William Casey. Now remember, since 1975, there is even more congressional oversight over the CIA. The CIA is not really able to do all the sneaky, semi-illegal things maybe they had done earlier in the Cold War. And since 1984, with the Boland Act, the administration cannot help the Contras in Nicaragua, no matter how much they'd like to get rid of the communist Sandinistas. But North and Casey secretly begin using money from marked up sales of weapons to Iran to fund the Contras. They overcharge the Iranians. They take that extra money from the sale of weapons to Iran. Even though those hostages have already been released, they continue to sell weapons to Iran. They overcharge them for those weapons. They use that extra money and funnel it to the Contras in Nicaragua. They're still fighting against the Sandinistas, so they have money from Oliver North and Casey of the CIA to continue to fight the communists. This is highly illegal. It breaks the Bland Amendment. We have an arms embargo on Iran and Iraq, and it's definitely unconstitutional because Congress is in charge of controlling the funds. Oliver North and others are prosecuted. William Casey dies before he can be prosecuted of old age. And President Reagan is only slightly tarnished by the incident. All right, let's look big picture again. Let's get back to the Soviet Union. I thought Ronald Reagan is credited with ending the Cold War. How do we get there? Well, remember, during the first term, he's very tough. and tensions escalate with the Soviet Union. But during the second term, Soviet leader Brezhnev is dead. And eventually, we have Premier Gorbachev in power in the Soviet Union. And Mikhail Gorbachev was a reformer, and he focused on two main reform programs. The first one he called Perestroika, which would restructure the Soviet economy, and it was badly in need of economic restructuring. And the second one is called Glasnost. Glasnost means political openness. No more oppression, suppression of dissident voices in the Soviet Union. The Afghan war had gone very bad for the Soviet Union. This is a reform severely needed by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, because of their struggling economy, could not really continue this arms race that had only been ramped up by the Strategic Defense Initiative, by Star Wars. Tensions, in fact, needed to go down so that the Soviet Union could address domestic concerns and assist people in Russia. So in 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This removes and destroys all medium-range missiles in Europe. Then in 1988, they worked together, the United States and the Soviet Union, to get Iran and Iraq to end their almost 10-year war with each other. And then the Soviet Union finally leaves Afghanistan. Afghanistan is like the Vietnam for the Soviet Union. They leave in the late 1980s, just as Ronald Reagan is leaving office. And so the Reagan administration really ends on a foreign policy high note. We're not quite at the end of the Cold War. We're not yet at the fall of the Berlin Wall. We're not yet at the disbanding of the Soviet Union, but we are getting close. The table is set.